Thank you, Chair Hirono, and thank you for calling this hearing. It's an issue where there's strong bipartisan support to make some bold reforms. Historian Irving Holley recognized in 1964 that, quote, the procurement process itself is a weapon of war, no less significant than the guns, airplanes, and rockets turned out by the arsenal of democracy in the United States. Unfortunately, right now, this is a weapon that's actually starting to be used against us. And I think in many ways, the purpose of this hearing is to start to turn that challenge around. Unfortunately, it was in the 1960s when the historian, Dr. Holley, mentioned this idea of how important the procurement process is to our national defense, that the Pentagon started adopting the bureaucratic rules and regulations that have come to define our acquisition process today. And it is not surprising that the rapid pace of defense innovation in World War II and the 2 decades after World War II has begun to slow down dramatically. Many of the more recent technologies had to be forced upon our acquisition process, such as unmanned systems, night vision, and proliferated satellites. While there has been no shortage of acquisition reform, as the chair stated, progress remains slow and inadequate. Officials in the Pentagon have not maximized the use of the substantial authorities already provided by Congress. For example, the middle tier of acquisition pathway was intended by Congress to simplify the process, empower program managers, and deliver capabilities within 2 to 5 years. By contrast, traditional programs take on average 11 years to reach initial operational capability. Unfortunately, many legacy programs are working their way back in and slowing down the pace. This seems par for the course with the Pentagon. Back in the 1990s, Congress created commercial item procedures so that the Pentagon could access companies that would otherwise not take on defense business. Since then, more than 165 unnecessary clauses have been added from the onerous federal acquisition regulation. The same problem is apparent with other transactions which were intended to ease the adoption of cutting-edge technologies. So today, for this hearing, it's an opportunity for our witnesses to diagnose why past efforts have failed and prescribe solutions to fully use existing authorities. While it may be a tall order to change the culture of the nearly 200,000 acquisition professionals on how they do their job, we must focus on our efforts on capabilities that can have the greatest impact within the next few years, including unmanned systems, munitions, and very importantly, software and software upgrades. At the same time, we in Congress have a role to play ourselves. We are certainly not without fault in these challenges. In some cases, burdensome approvals, documentation, and reporting requirements have been added to flexible authorities, in essence, wiping them out. I would appreciate if our witnesses could identify specific statutes that you believe constrain the Pentagon or additional authorities that could be useful. Moreover, acquisition reform can go on so far without improving flexibilities in the funding process. Earlier this morning, the full Armed Services Committee held a hearing on the Commission on Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution Reform. I would be appreciative if our witnesses made connections between those reforms that were highlighted in the full hearing today and the acquisition process, especially what we term the Valley of Death. Now, I know many of you are familiar with this. Here is what's happening. We have this great opportunity right now. 10 years ago, The vast majority of Silicon Valley and our tech communities were not interested in working with the Pentagon. You had the ridiculous situation, in my view, where Google employees said, hey, we're not going to do any work for the Pentagon. Okay, we're a free country, that's fine. But then we started to realize they were doing work with the Chinese Communist Party. That's not acceptable to anybody in this Senate. So what we have now is a change of culture in Silicon Valley and other tech communities where they want to work with the Pentagon. And you have funders who want to fund companies that can work with the Pentagon. This is a giant comparative advantage we have over our adversaries, like China and Russia, our innovative tech companies. But here's the problem. They're privately funded. Their funding doesn't last 3 to 4 to 5 years. It might last 6 months. And the Pentagon has been too slow to take up the opportunity to work with them, telling a high-tech company with a great product, we'll put you in our budget in 3 years. Well, they're going to be bankrupt in 6 months. That's the valley of death that is squandering opportunities, and it's a big focus of mine, and I would like to hear from the witnesses how we can address that. So I'd like to conclude, Madam Chair, with just by saying all the buzzwords on innovation and dual-use technologies are not translating into action. Here is a sad fact. It is taking a longer time for the Pentagon to award contracts, while at the same time the number of companies in the defense industrial base is shrinking. We have to reverse that. And we need big, bold ideas from all of you, whether to change the culture of the Pentagon or get Congress to get its act together to finally fix what we all recognize is a huge strategic challenge that hurts our ability to protect this nation. Thank you again to our witnesses and the chair for this hearing. I think it's really important. And again, there is enormous bipartisan support to fix this. Witnessed here by these two senators. We just need the good, big ideas in which to do it. Thank you. Great. Well, the chair went to go vote, so I'm going to take over here. Let me begin. Mr. Schwartz, did you bring a copy of the FAR?
Among other things, yes.
Can I see it? Can I see it? Or is it too heavy to lift?
I will lift it, but in comparison, this is the complete works of William Shakespeare. Right? So you also have the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation, and the PGI for the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation. Now, if you work for one of the services, there's more guidance and regulations, but I apologize, I ran out of paper this morning to print that. So it would be a little bit higher. This is what we have to do for acquisition. Now, when I was in grade school, it was hard enough for me to read William Shakespeare. This is a difficulty, and I think one of the things that this does is we're talking about empower the workforce. It freezes the workforce.
Yeah.
And I just want to tell one story about it, if I may. I remember after Hurricane Katrina and Rita, I went down with the GAO team to visit, and we're talking about to a bunch of contracting officers that are working really hard for recovery for people, right, for FEMA. And these people were working 16, 17-hour days.
Yeah.
And at one point they turned to us and said, just tell us what you want. You want small business, we'll get you small business. You want best price, we'll get you best price. You want speed, we'll get you speed. You want best quality, we'll get you best quality. We can't do it all the time. One, he is right, but two, what that concerns me with is the one thing he didn't mention is what's best for the people. He mentioned he's always thinking about what do the regulations tell me to do and what will I be yelled at.
Yeah. So let me ask this real quick. If you're a company with a great innovative idea and you've done a prototype on your own with private investor money, and you're like, all right, now I want to get this to the Pentagon because it's going to help in our upcoming war with China or whatever. Do they have to all of a sudden understand that stack? Or is that for the contracting officers or the combo?
It's both, right? The contracting officers for sure. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. But you need to know if you need a cost accounting system. You need to know if you have to have certain small business plans. You need to know what domestic buying requirements you have. You need to know.
So if you're beginning an innovative American company, which again, in my view, is a giant strategic advantage we have over everybody else, and now they're interested. These great Americans who are really innovative and really smart want to help. They see the challenges in the world. They see that the authoritarian dictatorships are on the march, whether in Iran, China, Russia, North Korea, working together. So they want to help. But then they see that and they're just like, what?
They don't. Many don't. I know a company that has a great technology, someone who worked on the Hill. And I said, this is great. Have you brought this to DOD? He said, I'm not going to. It's just not worth it. We are small. We have a great technology. We have limited resources. I'm not going through that. And it broke my heart.
Yeah. Okay, let me ask Dr. Greenwald, one thing that I think a lot of people miss. So I like to read a lot of history. I'm reading this really good book that was actually given to me by the CNO a couple of weeks ago called The Admirals, and it's all about the five-star admirals that we had during World War II. And the innovation, and of course that was an entire societal effort, but I think I'm trying to remember, I don't want to get the numbers incorrect, but you know, we cranked out in 1943 or 42 to 43, I think like 17 aircraft carriers or something, and then by 44 it was just, the numbers are incredible. But the innovation was also occurring, as you just mentioned, in the 50s. So we're not like at World War II levels of entire economy focus. We're in peace, with the exception, of course, the Korean War, which is a big exception. But so what happened after that? You just gave some good examples. The other one I always like to cite is the SR-71, which I think I've read, you know, they designed on a slide rule and it came, you know, from concept to prototype in 18 months or something crazy like that. And that spy plane lasted for decades. So what happened? Like what happened between the 50s SR-71 and the F-35 that took, I think, 25 years to field? What happened in your view?
It's a long story, but I'll try to summarize. In the 1960s, we adopted a way of putting a system around all of that innovation. And I even kind of think about, there's the good Rickover and the bad Rickover. And the good Rickover was the one who essentially was of the time-based innovation approach, you know, developed the first nuclear naval reactor. If you remember how many classes of nuclear submarines were created in the 50s to get to the point where we wanted to. Well, we got to the point where we wanted to, and then we decided, well, we're going to manufacture these. And we shifted into a different system. And what we should have done is had two acquisition systems. One for how to be incredibly innovative and drive new technology into the hands of the warfighter, and the other one was how to produce systems at scale.
Right.
But when we started producing systems at scale, Admiral Rickover wanted cost accounting standards. He wanted you know, greater insight into contractor costs. And that's kind of the, I'm not going to say the bad Rickover, that's just the Rickover that transitioned to something that was needed to produce things at scale. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we adopted what were business best practices of the 1950s from the private sector, which actually weren't really good business best practices. And they were based on centralized planning, based on prediction, very linear ways of thinking. They were brought from Ford Motor Company with McNamara in the 60s. And the DoD adopted these writ large. And we've been working on this system for the last 60 years. But what happened is we didn't quite realize that the same management system didn't work out very well for the private sector. The Japanese essentially, with quality management and other approaches, essentially outcompeted us. And the private sector threw out all this centralized planning. They threw out all of this ways of this bureaucratized linear process. But the Department of Defense never did. And so, you know, we adopted many of those processes. We essentially looked at our adversary, the Soviet Union, and mirrored some of their processes.
Yeah.
And we created a morass of bureaucracy in the 60s. So the thought is, let's go back to the 50s. Let's go back to how we can produce things better and create two acquisition systems that essentially can complement each other.
Good. Great. Well, listen, a lot more to discuss. When you talk about imitating our adversaries, I've always thought it would make a lot of sense. Hopefully no Chinese communist officials are listening right now, but we mark that giant pile top secret. They've been stealing all our stuff anyways. We dump it in front of the Chinese embassy and hopefully they get it and like, oh, this is amazing, we'll use this. And then we'll destroy their system the way we've kind of destroyed our system, but maybe that wouldn't work. I do want to, Mr. Greenwald, I want to, or Dr. Greenwald, I want to just follow up, and this is for all three of you. This idea, and I've heard it a lot, and I think it makes a lot of sense. The idea of maybe a two-track system. And, you know, you have the system that you need. It's kind of a command economy system that you need to build a sub or a aircraft carrier. Okay, we all get that. But, and that has its own processes and everything. But another track that would be much more focused on speed, and although the first track should be focused on speed too. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more? And any other witnesses who want to, if you think that's a good idea?
Be happy to. And I think the acquisition pathways that DoD has come forward with actually is trying to do that. So the major capability area pathway is exactly what we were talking about as far as the submarines and the large legacy production of things that we're going to continue to produce as platforms in the next few decades.
And there's no giant market for subs, right? I mean, there's one buyer. I mean, well, maybe a few buyers. But.
It's a different industrial-based problem. It's a different acquisition problem. Now, yes, efficiencies can be had, but a lot of it is just dealing with the industrial base and addressing throughput in budget and long-term multi-year type procurements would be something that would be helpful there. In the innovation side, that should be a time-based innovation process, and we have two pathways, actually three pathways that could be helpful there. The rapid acquisition pathway, which is the pathway that was created essentially with congressional authority in the early 2000s to deal with post 9/11 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And those were designed to deploy capability of the warfighter in less than 2 years.
Okay, is that working?
It has worked in the past. It seems
to be
a few times. The key thing there is it has the ability to start things without a new start authority, and it has flexible funds to move forward on those type of starts. Probably in that area, the most important thing would be is to bring the combatant commanders into the equation more than they are, and potentially even to think about some type of limited acquisition authority for them to drive some of that change, or at least some type of limited demand.
So that's authority you think they have that they're not using?
They don't have that authority.
Oh, they don't have
the command commanders do not have the authority. The SOCOM does, and the Cyber Command has said to
give it to other combatant commanders.
But the geographical commands do not. We had.
Was that a good idea for this year's NDAA, for example?
If you did, you could create authority like we had with JIFCOM. Joint Forces Command was designed to essentially buy on behalf of the geographical commands and drive innovation into the geographical commands.
Should we give that to every combatant commander?
You could do that. They may not be able to handle it, but at least someone you should pilot it and think about the possibility of doing that. The third pathway is middle tier, and middle tier is the 3 to 5. And again, that authority, if you give it to the right organizations and they can drive innovation, we can be seeing that.
But again, didn't we already provide that authority in all those areas?
You have provided that authority, and it's being used probably about 1% of the budget. It's now being used middle tier. I mean, that's where we are.
Any other thoughts on these two questions, gentlemen? Mr. Levine?
So, Senator Sullivan, yes. You're absolutely right. We need at least two pathways, and as Bill has been talking about, we do
maybe
have,
more than two?
We have a lot more than two, and that's a good thing, and we're underutilizing some of them. I think that's all fair. The one that I would point you to is the software acquisition pathway.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot more we need to do in that area. Software is unique. We need to buy it differently. I have
Almost the flip side of a carrier, right? Because the software you're updating every 6 months, right? And you have
Maybe
to.
every 6 days.
You're updating frequently, and this is an area particularly, you mentioned the PPBE Commission earlier, where there's a
Yeah.
recommendation in there that I would point you to, which is as you update software frequently, you're going through development, procurement, testing, debugging, redevelopment, reprocuring, refielding, going around that and around that and around that. If you use the traditional funding system, that means you're changing color of money maybe several times in a year. And to get that right and have the right color of money, I assume color of money is good, and to have the right color of money at the right time in the right place is almost an impossibility. And so what we say is, let's have a different rule for software. If you're buying a software with O&M, go ahead and develop it and test it and field it. If you're buying with procurement, same thing. Go through the entire cycle and just stay in the same color of money, because we know software is different, and you have to be able to go through that and have
Like
that
a
flexibility.
private company would.
Absolutely. You're not going to have to go back and ask Congress because I went through a new cycle where I'm debugging something, and now that counts as development, and I need to get a different color of money.
So that's one of your
doesn't work.
big recommendations?
It's
And we have not.
It's a small recommendation.
Well, it sounds,
Compared to some of the
sounds
others.
pretty substantial to me, but
an
we
important
don't. That authority doesn't exist right now?
No, it doesn't. There's some.
That would have to be legislated.
It would have to be. It's complicated. So it's in the federal financial regulation, which you would say is just legislative, but in fact it's sort of dictated by the Appropriations Committee. So you risk getting crossways of the appropriators who feel strongly about how their money is spent. And
Yeah, that happens here a lot, as
Yes.
you know. Okay, Mr. Schwartz, any other?
Yeah, I'll just add two things. One is, I've seen that problem with the budget and IT systems, and even not IT or software, all the time, and it has a lot of impacts. One is schedule, of course, but the other one is the time it takes to figure these things out. I remember being in a meeting with two programs. One had too much money, one had too little money because of their schedules in the same PEO office, and they couldn't move it, right? And so an hour-and-a-half meeting, probably 45 minutes was spent on how do they deal with these issues, and that has these knock-on effects.
Senator, if I could just add
Yeah.
one other thing on software. I worked with the Defense and Innovation Board's software. I can't remember DIB-swap acquisition, whatever their software acquisition process study, whatever they called it. And they had a recommendation for a separate software acquisition pathway, which Congress adapted. There was one piece of their recommendation that Bill and I actually worked on together, which I thought was very important, which Congress did not adopt. And I have it in my testimony, but I think it's worth mentioning here. The issue is that you have some software engineers and developers who are much better and more productive than others. The way our federal acquisition system works, when we run a competition, price has to be a factor. And when price is a factor for something we don't know what we're going to build yet, the way we consider price is by considering rates. So if Company A is going to charge me $300 an hour for an engineer, and Company B is going to charge me $250 an hour for an engineer, that looks less expensive. Of course, the $300 engineer may be 10 times as good, and proving that and justifying going to the high-priced contractor is hard. So what we recommended is that this is an area where we need to learn the lesson that we did 50 years ago, 40 years ago with architect-engineer contracts, where we said, let's do a competition initially in certain circumstances where it's appropriate that's based purely on qualifications, and get the best guy in here to do the job, because this is software where the best guy is where it's really critical software, and I want to have the best guy. So I'm going to do a competition based on qualifications, and once I get the best guy in, then I'll negotiate a price with him.
Is that in your recommendation too?
It is. And we do that for architects and engineers on the theory that if you're building critical infrastructure, you don't want to go to the low-price bidder to design it.
Oh, okay.
You should have the same thing, you should have that same authority for software.
Yeah, one more question before I turn to Senator Kelly. This issue of the Valley of Death and again, I think this is a giant strategic opportunity for us, now that we have all these tech companies and innovators who really want to help on our national defense. I know it's a complicated issue. I hear it from so many, and I'm sure all of you do too. What would you, in all of your vast experiences, A, do you agree with me it's a big problem? And it's also an opportunity that we have, again, this part of our economy that wants to help the Pentagon. And then what would you give to us as kind of the, top 3 pithy recommendations, and are they regs or is it authorities that we need to provide? And I'll just open that up to all 3 of you.
Senator, let me just take that one too, just at least to start, because this is something the PPBE Commission spent a lot of time thinking about. This deals with how we fund things. And there are 2 different ways that the PPBE Commission went at this. One is the question of the way the budget is structured. So we structure our budget into such small boxes that it's hard to move money around, so it's hard to make it available if we have an opportunity that shows up in the year of execution. So the technology is suddenly proven, and we don't have any money in the right box, so we can't make it available.
And the company goes out of business.
And the company may go out of business. Exactly. So we have budget structure recommendations to talk about structuring the budget differently so that money is more flexible. We have reprogramming recommendations, which talk about making it easier to move money if you need to at the last minute. And we have smaller recommendations like the software recommendation I just mentioned to you about relieving some of the pressure on software that would make money more flexible, and all these things that make it, that gave you, and we have recommendations about delegating further down within the Department of Defense, so things the department can do itself, delegating further down within the Department of Defense, writing budget justifications more clearly. All these things can provide more flexibility in the year of execution, which can make it easier to move money, which can make it easier to solve problems like that. The one thing I would add to that is I don't want to make it like this is a complete panacea, because a part of the problem will always be, is there enough money? So, and where do we find the money? So it would be nice if we could commit to all these companies, if your technology proves out, we'll fund it. But we don't have enough money to make that commitment to all those companies. And sometimes it proves out, and we have to look at it and say, well, it would be nice to have, but I don't have money for it.
Yeah.
And so the problem won't go away even if you make the process easier, but we ought to take out some of these hurdles that we've got in the system.
Okay. Any other quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the Department of Defense needs to start looking as it is a venture capital firm. And there's a valley of death in the VC world from round A to round B to round C to round D, and we could be looking at the same thing for initial prototype, advanced prototype, operational prototype, and so on. And there should be bridge funds between every one of those just like a VC would, and if something hits, we're going to spend it on this, and it's flexible enough to do that. I would bring together like the VCs do, which essentially is they compete. The companies are competing for their money all the time, and I would bring the entire industrial base, if it's possible, into an OTA consortium, a non-traditional OTA consortium, to do that, where you could essentially drive round A's, round B's, round C's, round D's, different types of competitions within that industrial base for the type of programs necessary. Because if they hit, then you can go to the next bridge fund and say, okay, this is C round, we're going to go for it. If you don't have enough money in your D round funds, well, then everyone's just kind of going to go away. But if you've got that money that's flexible enough to put on the table, if someone succeeds, then you've got something. And I have to say the most successful OTA we've had was with SpaceX, in the sense that we promised that they would essentially, if you can build it, we'll pay for it. NRAPs were the same way. If you build it, we will have money to put on it. That offer of some kind of potential payoff is what will leap over the valley of death. But if you don't have it, you're always going to have a valley of death.
I will say that I can remember sitting in DMAGS, this is the senior DOD budget decision forum, and having the group make a decision, we're going to fund these dozen different experiments in an area, and having the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition stand up and say, I'm all for funding these, it's the right thing to do, but you all should know, if they're successful, we don't have money to field any of them.
So, 3 things. Let me perhaps suggest guiding lights, but before I do, to reiterate one thing Peter said, this is very hard, this is very complicated. I would suggest no 3 ideas will absolutely solve the problem. Right? It's a lot of ideas and a lot of effort in a lot of ways over time. It's very complicated, but some guiding lights, if I may offer. The first one is, you mentioned, Senator, all these VCs and other companies that want to help. They also need to run a business. And sometimes DoD doesn't recognize cash flow and profits matter to these companies. And if they can't make money, if they jeopardize their commercial markets, they are not going to stay in this business and we will lose them. There's a reason why the defense industrial base has decreased in size for the last 12 years. Second guiding light, time matters for these companies. They don't have the luxury that DoD does of saying, well, we're going to delay delivery because this part isn't qualifying when it's not a safety issue. Right? That is a problem. Time for delivery, time to contract. In this warp speed, which was another successful OTA, in fact, General Perna said warp speed wouldn't have gone at warp speed without an OTA in that particular case, was his exact quote. Time matters to companies, and DoD doesn't always appreciate that. And the third thing I would say is relationships matter to industry. You know, sometimes, industry has a setback, sometimes DoD gets a setback. But it's not about always what's the letter of the contract or the law, but how you work together. And I would suggest they could probably use a relationship therapist sometimes.
Mia, I just had one final question on, and this again can be for everybody, but Mr. Schwartz, can you discuss some of your findings on the other transactions consortia and whether they lower the barrier to entry for non-traditional defense contractors?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the credit for those authorities are for the other people here. But I'll give you a couple of examples. So the other transaction authority, we already went through the data of how the number of companies in consortia have increased dramatically, where at the same time the defense industrial base has decreased. The way Operation Warp Speed worked is that a consortia was put together. Consortia, in short, is a number of companies all with a similar interest around a particular technology, in this case health, because it can be a broad thing. And there were a lot of companies, and they had been working together already, and they already have existing base contracts with the Department of Defense in this particular case. So they already know each other, they already have the mechanisms, they already have the processes and the relationships down. So what happened here is, with Operation Warp Speed, DoD said, this is what we need. And I might get the numbers a little bit wrong, it is in this report that I have on consortia right in front of me. In something like 72 hours, I think it was, they got out requests to something like 1,100 companies, right? In days, they got responses because it was already set up. And that helps with the market research, and it helps with the processes, so you don't have to start going through this because it was already put in place. That's the power of what consortia can do. It increases communication between the government and industry. It increases the ability to work more efficiently because most consortia work with other transaction authorities, and other transaction authority, for the most part, are exempt from most of the regulations in the federal acquisition regulation. Now, it's not for everybody, and it's not for all circumstances. It is definitely not a silver bullet, but it does do that. And there are small companies that have said, and I can absolutely provide this information after the hearing, that but for the consortia they worked with, they never would have contracted with the Department of Defense. Does that help?
Yeah, very helpful. Good. Well, thank you, Madam Chair.